From the outside, Japan appears to be a country with two different major religions, Shinto and Buddhism. Each town and city has several Shinto shrines and several Buddhist temples. In truth, however, Japanese religion is a complex mix of these and some other faiths. It's a combination that's evolved organically over hundreds of years, with little centralization or input from the authorities. But that didn't stop the authorities from trying. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 positioned the emperor as the de facto ruler of Japan. His government enacted two major religious reforms, one at the very beginning of his rule in 1868, and the other shortly before his death in 1912. On a long enough timeline, they failed. Most shrines and temples in the year 2021 are rather similar to how they were in 1867. But these reforms had an outsized short-term impact on Japan's course in the early 20th century, and there was a serious chance of one or both religions suffering a fatal blow. To tell the story of Shinto, Japan's indigenous quote-unquote faith, we really have to start with Buddhism, which was imported to Japan from China around the 8th century. Prior to Buddhism's arrival, the word Shinto did not exist. It was created in contrast to Buddhism to describe the general spiritual beliefs of Japanese. Some scholars will even argue that Shinto didn't truly exist until the first major reform we're about to discuss. Buddhism did not replace Shinto or compete with it, but instead just melded with it. Even today, the two religions are inexorably linked in perfect syncretism. Buddhist temples have Shinto torii gates on their premises. Shinto shrines are dedicated to Buddhist gods. During the political upheaval of the 15th and 16th centuries, Buddhist temples amassed a great deal of influence. Temples like Koyasan became political entities unto themselves. So when the new emperor took power in 1868, one of his government's goals was to break the power of the temples. This was accomplished via a policy known as Shinto-Buddhism separation. This mandated that Shinto and Buddhism be treated as entirely separate religions, and in practice, it meant that Shinto shrines gained a good deal of power at the expense of the temples. Not only had the government weakened the Buddhist priest's position, it also sparked a nationalistic fervor by emphasizing native Japanese Shinto over foreign Buddhism. The common folk, who were incensed by centuries of mandatory tithing to Buddhist temples, took their patriotism even further than the government had intended and spontaneously destroyed thousands of temples. To-no-mine Temple in Nara Prefecture took a unique approach to surviving this policy. Like most temples, it had mixed Buddhism and Shinto elements, so the priests in charge redesigned the Buddhist architecture as Shinto structures and reincorporated the temple as Tanzan Shrine. Shinto-Buddhism separation only lasted for a few years and was generally considered a failure. Today, both Shinto and Buddhism still exist in relative harmony. But the major lasting impact of this order was the conception of these two separate religions as two separate religions, instead of an indistinct mess of spirituality. The government's renewed focus on Shinto allowed it to use shrines as a medium for government propaganda. The Meiji government heavily promoted the cult of the emperor, which emphasized the idea that Emperor Meiji was directly descended from the gods of the Shinto pantheon. In 1906, the government worked to strengthen its hold on Shinto through a policy called shrine consolidation. Instead of each town and city having numerous small shrines scattered about, there would be one central shrine for each municipality. A smaller number of shrines would make it easier for the government to distribute talking points to priests, and the land on which those outmoded shrines once stood would belong to the government, granting them a great deal of property. While the populace had generally supported Shinto-Buddhism separation, shrine consolidation was met with irritation at best and angry protest at worst. This was especially strong in Wakayama Prefecture, where shrine consolidation was unusually zealous. almost 70% of shrines in the prefecture were abolished, which is even more shocking when you look around and see how many of them there still are today. Local celebrity Minakata Kumagusu, who was, among many other things, a scientist, led several anti-consolidation protests and spurred a letter-writing campaign. He objected to consolidation on both historical and biological grounds, as most shrines tend to be surrounded by trees. He also got drunk and threw slime into a town meeting, because with Minakata, you get the whole package. As with Shinto-Buddhism separation, shrine consolidation petered out after only a few years, but it did have short-term ramifications. The increased emphasis on Shinto, nationalism, and the deification of the emperor were major factors in Japan's imperial gains before and during the Second World War. This is sometimes referred to as state Shinto, which is a little bit of an odd term as it originates from the post-World War II United States forces occupying Japan. State Shinto was used to denote Shinto as a vehicle for emperor worship, as opposed to folk Shinto, which is basically Shinto as it existed before and after this period. This was a surprisingly thoughtful distinction by the US. Separating the political aspects of Shinto from the religion allowed Japanese people to maintain both Shinto beliefs and the emperor, but not the emperor as a Shinto deity. As the anti-shrine consolidation protests demonstrate, banning Shinto would have been an incredibly unpopular move. And it's certainly easy to believe that a disinterested occupying force could do such a thing. For an example of that counterfactual, let's take a depressing detour into the far future of 2003. The United States has just invaded Iraq, and during the occupation, it enforces a policy called de-Baathification, or banning members of the ruling Ba'ath Party from public service positions. However, membership in the Ba'ath Party was mandatory for higher-ranking civil servants, doctors, and college students. If you wanted to be somebody in Iraq, you had to join the Ba'ath Party, whether you agreed with it or not. So when the US enacted de-Baathification, they rendered a sizable chunk of the country essentially unemployable. With no other options, several of these people would go on to join an organization that today is known as ISIS. Who knows what could have happened in Japan if the US had demonstrated the same callous disregard they did in Iraq? Despite periods of real danger, both Buddhism and Shinto made it through to the modern day relatively unscathed, albeit as more like two religions instead of one. People still participate in festivals at shrines and hold memorial services at Buddhist cemeteries. Some people go to church on Sundays too, but that didn't really take. That, however, is a story for another day.